You wake up in a room that reeks of rot and cheap whiskey. The walls are damp, stained with something darker than mold. Edinburgh, 1828. Old town. The kind of place where light doesn't reach, where the air itself feels like it's choking on its own filth. You hear laughter through the thin wall, sharp, drunk, then, suddenly, nothing. Just silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. This is not a ghost story. This is not a mystery. This is a transaction. The floor beneath you is sticky. You don't want to know why. Outside, the narrow alleyways are piled with waste, with bodies of the poor who died and were forgotten before they even hit the ground. But here, in this room, the dead are not forgotten. They are valuable. They are currency. Desperation is the only religion in this God-forsaken corner of the world, and survival demands a price no one wants to name. You feel it in your gut. Something is wrong. Not just with this room, but with the city itself. With the people who smile in daylight and trade in flesh when the sun goes down. And the transaction, it's already begun. Poverty doesn't just take from you. It eats you from the inside. It makes you forget your name, your worth, your humanity. In 1820s Edinburgh, the poor weren't just invisible, they were prey. The city glittered with Enlightenment philosophy and medical advancement. But beneath the cobblestones, people rotted alive. No work, no food, no future. Just the slow, grinding erasure of everything you once were. William Burke and William Hare were not monsters. Not yet. They were two men drowning in debt, suffocating under the weight of a world that had no use for them. Irish immigrants in a city that despised the foreign and the poor. They ran a boarding house for people even more desperate than themselves, the kind of place where you pay for a corner to sleep in, where death is just another tenant who never leaves. And then, one winter night, one of those tenants died. Natural causes. Old age, maybe, doesn't matter. What mattered was the body. What mattered was the whisper they'd heard in the tavern, passed between medical students with too much coin and too little conscience. The anatomists are paying for cadavers. No questions asked. A corpse was worth more than a living man. The old man died quietly. No drama, no struggle, just a rattle in his chest, then stillness. He owed rent. He had no family. No one would come looking for him. In another world, they would have buried him in a pauper's grave, unmarked, forgotten, returned to the earth like he never existed at all. But Burke and Hare stood over the body and saw something else. Not a man, not a soul, a solution. £7. That's what the anatomists at the medical school were paying. £7 for a fresh cadaver, no questions asked. The city's hunger for medical knowledge had created a market, and the market didn't care where the bodies came from. Grave robbing was common. Risky, yes, but profitable. But this? This was a gift. Death had delivered opportunity right to their doorstep. They wrapped him in a sack like spoiled meat, carried him through the dark streets to Dr. Knox's anatomy theater, handed him over, collected the money. It was that simple, that clean. The doctor didn't ask how the man died, didn't ask his name. He only weighed the flesh, checked the freshness, and paid. £7. More than either of them had seen in months. And as they walked back through the reeking alleys, the money heavy in their pockets, a question whispered in the dark. Why wait for the next one to die? Edinburgh was the center of the medical world. Surgeons, students, anatomists, all hungry for knowledge, for progress, for bodies to cut open and study. The law allowed only the corpses of executed criminals to be used for dissection. But there weren't enough hangings to feed the demand, not nearly enough. So the doctors turned a blind eye. Dr. Robert Knox was a brilliant anatomist, charismatic, respected. His lectures were packed with eager students willing to pay top price for a chance to learn from the best. But brilliance requires fuel, and Knox's fuel was flesh. Fresh flesh? He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know. When Burke and Hare showed up at his door with another body, Knox simply nodded, inspected the corpse, and paid. This wasn't ignorance, this was complicity. The system needed men like Burke and Hare. It needed the desperate, the invisible, the ones willing to do what polite society could not. The anatomists built their reputations on stolen bodies, on the poor and the forgotten, carved open in the name of science. They called it progress. They called it enlightenment. But progress has a price, and someone, somewhere, always pays it in blood. Burke and Hare looked at each other and understood. Demand was endless. Supply was limited. Death was too slow. But death could be accelerated. They needed a method. Something clean, something that left no trace. Suffocation. A pillow pressed over the face. A hand clamped over the mouth and nose. Weight on the chest until the lungs give up. No blood, no bruising, no wounds to raise suspicion. To the anatomist, it looks like natural death. A body that simply stopped breathing. Perfect, efficient, invisible. Imagine it. You're lying in bed, sick, weak, barely holding on. You hear footsteps, someone enters. You think maybe they're bringing soup or water or just checking on you. But then the weight comes down, the pillow, the hand. You try to scream, but there's no air. You try to fight, but your body is too frail, too broken. Your lungs burn, your vision darkens. And the last thing you feel is the cold realization. No one is coming to save you. Burke and Hare perfected this. They turned murder into labor, a trade, a craft. There was no anger in it, no hatred, just the cold calculation of men who had learned that a body, fresh, unmarked, delivered on time, was worth more than a life. The first victim they created was an old man, sick. Dying anyway, they told themselves. No family, no one to miss him. They sold him for £7. And then they did it again. They didn't choose randomly, they chose carefully. The homeless man sleeping in the alley. The drunk woman stumbling out of the tavern. The sex worker no one would report missing. The elderly lodger with no family, no friends, no ties to the world. These were people society had already discarded. People whose names were never written down, whose faces were never remembered. They existed in the margins, in the shadows, and when they vanished, the world simply shrugged and moved on. Burke and Hare understood this. They understood that invisibility was vulnerability, that poverty was a kind of erasure, that some lives, in the eyes of the city, were already worth nothing. So they became hunters, predators with a system. They lured victims with promises of shelter, food, warmth, a place to sleep, a drink to ease the cold. And when the door closed behind them, when the night swallowed their last breath, no one came looking. No one asked questions, no one cared. Mary Patterson, James Wilson, Maggie Docherty. These are the names we know now. But how many others were there? How many nameless, faceless souls were suffocated in that room and delivered to the anatomist's table, their bodies carved apart in the name of progress, while their identities dissolved into nothing. One body became two. Two became five. Five became 10. The killing became routine, mechanical, a job. Here is where the soul dies, not in the first murder, not in the second, but in the moment when murder becomes mundane. Burke and Hare woke up, ate breakfast, killed someone, and went to the pub. They laughed, they drank. They argued over petty things, money, chores. Who would carry the body this time? Death became domestic, a routine, a chore to check off the list before supper. The human mind is terrifyingly adaptable. It can normalize anything if exposed long enough. What once required justification, he was dying anyway, she had no one, it's mercy, really, no longer needed explanation. The killing simply was. Like washing dishes. Like sweeping the floor. Their partners knew. Helen McDougall, Burke's mistress, Margaret Hare, William's wife. They helped lure victims. They helped wrap the bodies. They took the money and bought bread with blood-stained hands. The rot spread. It wasn't just two men anymore. It was a household, a family business. At what point does a human stop being human? Is it the first time you take a life? Or is it the 10th when you no longer feel anything at all? But then came Mary Patterson, young, beautiful, known in the neighborhood. Her body arrived at Dr. Knox's table, and for the first time, students whispered. Someone recognized her. The pattern was breaking. Mary Patterson was 18 years old, a sex worker, known in the streets of Edinburgh. She had a face people remembered, young, delicate, alive in a way that made her death impossible to ignore. Burke lured her in with whiskey and promises. She died like the others, suffocated, silent. Her body was delivered to Dr. Knox's anatomy theater, fresh and unmarked. But this time, something shifted. The students recognized her. They whispered her name as Knox laid her out on the table. They had seen her in the streets just days before. They knew she hadn't been sick, hadn't been dying. Some of them had even spoken to her. And Knox? He continued. He dissected her anyway. He carved her open in front of a room full of men who knew something was wrong. But no one stopped him. No one reported it. No one asked the question that should have shattered everything. Where are all these bodies coming from? Because the truth was inconvenient. The truth would disrupt the lectures, the progress, the enlightenment they were so proud of, so they swallowed their suspicion and moved on. Mary Patterson should have been the end. Her death should have exposed the whole operation. But it didn't. Because some deaths are mourned. Others are currency. And the machine that ran on bodies didn't stop for a dead girl no one important cared about. Burke and Hare kept killing for months after. By day, they were no one. Just two men among thousands. Burke ran errands, drank at the tavern, smiled at neighbors. Hare managed his boarding house, complained about the weather, argued over rent. They lived ordinary lives, they were ordinary men. By night, they hunted. This is the most unsettling truth. Evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a sign. It lives next door. It drinks at your pub. It asks how your day was and laughs at your jokes. Burke and Hare walked the same streets as their victims, breathed the same air, and no one suspected a thing. 16 people. 10 months. A body every few weeks, delivered fresh to the anatomist's table, sold for 7 to 10 pounds each. Over 100 pounds in total, a fortune for men who had nothing. And still, no one noticed. No one connected the disappearances, because the disappeared were already invisible. Compartmentalization is a kind of madness. The ability to split yourself in two. The man who shakes your hand, and the man who would suffocate you if the price was right. Burke and Hare perfected this. They wore their humanity like a coat they could take off and hang by the door. But every secret has a rhythm, and every rhythm eventually breaks. A body discovered too soon. A neighbor who wouldn't stop asking questions. The mask was slipping. October 31st, 1828, Halloween, a night for ghosts and masks. Anne Gray, a lodger, is looking for her belongings. She searches the room, frustrated, suspicious. Something smells wrong. Not just the usual stench of poverty and unwashed bodies, something else. Something sweet and rotten. She kneels down, reaches under the bed. Her hand brushes straw, then cloth, then something cold. Skin. She pulls back the straw and sees her, Margaret Docherty, an old woman, a guest from the night before, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, dead, hidden, stashed like cargo waiting for delivery. Anne Gray screams. Burke and Hare stumble in, panicked, frantic. They try to explain. She died naturally. We were going to report it. Please, please don't tell anyone. They offer her money, 10 shillings, a week's wages. Just keep quiet. Just forget what you saw. But Anne Gray is already running. Out the door, down the street, to the police. The secret is out. Burke and Hare are arrested within hours. The bodies stop flowing to Dr. Knox's theater. The machine grinds to a halt. But this isn't justice, not yet. This is just the beginning of another kind of horror, because now the city wants a show, and Edinburgh always gets what it wants. The trial was a spectacle, a performance, the kind Edinburgh hadn't seen in decades. Crowds packed the courtroom. Newspapers printed every grotesque detail. Street vendors sold pamphlets with lurid illustrations of the murders. People lined up for hours just to catch a glimpse of the killers, as if evil was something you could see, something you could point at and say, there, that's the monster. But this wasn't about truth. This was about theater. William Hare made a deal. He turned King's evidence, testified against Burke in exchange for immunity. He walked free. The man who had killed just as many, who had suffocated just as many lives, simply left, disappeared into history, unpunished. Burke stood alone in the dock, the scapegoat, the villain the city needed. And Dr. Knox? The anatomist who had bought 16 bodies without asking a single question. He was never charged, never even called to testify. The system protected its own. The respectable, the educated, the men who wore fine coats and spoke in Latin, they were untouchable. The crowd didn't want accountability. They wanted blood. They wanted a monster to hang so they could go home feeling safe, feeling righteous, feeling like justice had been done. Burke would give them that. One last body, one final transaction, his own. January the 28th, 1829. A cold, gray morning. 25,000 people gathered to watch William Burke hang. They cheered, they jeered, they brought their children. Vendors sold pies and ale. It was a carnival, a festival of death. Burke stood on the scaffold, a rope around his neck, and for a moment, just a moment, he was human again, afraid, small, mortal. Then the floor dropped. His body jerked, swung. The crowd roared. But the horror didn't end there. Burke's corpse was delivered to the very place he had supplied for so long, the anatomy theater. Professor Alexander Monroe dissected him publicly. Thousands came to watch. They paid for tickets. They took notes. They marveled at the irony. The man who sold bodies, carved open like the victims he created. His skeleton was bleached, articulated, displayed in a museum where it still hangs today. His skin was tanned, turned into wallets, notebooks, calling card cases. Pieces of William Burke were sold as souvenirs, mementos of justice, proof that evil had been punished. Even in death, he was denied humanity. He became exactly what he had made of others, a commodity, flesh stripped of name, of story, of soul. The crowd got their spectacle, their closure. But what about the others? What happened to those who walked away? William Hare walked free. The man who had killed just as many, who had held the pillow just as firmly, simply vanished. Some say he fled to England. Others say he was thrown into a lime pit by an angry mob. No one knows. No one cared enough to find out. He disappeared into the cracks of history, unpunished, unnamed, erased. Dr. Robert Knox continued teaching. His career suffered, yes, protests, public outcry, burned effigies. But he was never charged, never arrested, never held accountable for the 16 bodies he bought without question. He moved to London, continued his work, died of natural causes years later. Respected, remembered. Helen McDougall, Burke's mistress, was released. Insufficient evidence, they said. She vanished too. Margaret Hare, William's wife, walked away. No trial, no consequences. The system punished the visible monster and protected everyone else. The poor Irish immigrant hanged in front of a cheering crowd while the educated, the respectable, the complicit walked free. Burke and Hare were not anomalies. They were symptoms, products of a society that valued corpses over lives, progress over ethics, profit over humanity. So here is the question history forces us to ask. Who truly killed those 16 people? The men who held the pillow? Or the system that paid them to? Guilt is not a single thread, it's a web. Dr. Knox bought bodies he knew were suspicious. The students whispered but said nothing. The institutions built their reputations on stolen flesh. The laws made poverty a crime and corpses a commodity. And society, polite, enlightened, progressive society, looked the other way because the alternative was inconvenient. This is how evil flourishes. Not through monsters, but through complicity, through silence, through the collective agreement that some lives matter less than others. Burke held the pillow. But who placed the pillow in his hand? The system that denied the poor work, food, dignity, the laws that made it easier to sell a body than survive with one. The medical establishment that demanded fresh cadavers but refused to ask where they came from. The crowds that cheered at Burke's execution but never questioned Knox. The society that erected statues to progress while building its foundation on bones. In 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed, a direct response to the Burke and Hare murders. Finally, legal access to bodies for dissection. Progress, they called it. Reform. But read the fine print, the bodies donated were those of the poor, the unclaimed, the workhouse dead. Once again, it was the invisible, the powerless, the forgotten who paid the price. The law changed, the logic didn't. And here's the truth that should terrify you. This didn't end in 1828. The market still exists, it just wears a different mask. Today, we don't suffocate the poor in boarding houses. We don't deliver them to anatomists in burlap sacks. But the logic remains. Bodies are still currency. Desperation is still exploited. The vulnerable are still harvested. Organ trafficking thrives in the shadows of poverty. Black markets for kidneys, livers, corneas, bought from those with no other choice, sold to those who can afford not to ask questions. Medical trials target the poor, the incarcerated, the marginalized, offering pennies for their blood, their cells, their participation in experiments they barely understand. Even legal systems echo the Anatomy Act. Who donates their body to science? Rarely the rich, rarely the powerful. It's still the unclaimed, the forgotten, the ones whose families can't afford burial. The mechanisms have changed, the morality hasn't. When profit and desperation collide, the same patterns emerge, the same people are sacrificed, the same institutions look away. Burke and Hare are not historical curiosities, they are reflections, warnings, proof that when society treats human beings as resources, someone will inevitably commodify them. So why do we tell this story? Why does it haunt us nearly 2 centuries later? Because we recognize something in it, something we don't want to name. Burke's skeleton still hangs in a museum in Edinburgh, behind glass, a tourist attraction. People take photos. They marvel at the irony. They buy postcards in the gift shop. Even in death, he remains a commodity. The story is still being sold. Why are we so drawn to this? Why does this nightmare endure, retold in books, films, documentaries, YouTube videos narrated by voices like mine. Why do we consume horror with such hunger? Part of it is the thrill, the safe distance. We can peer into the abyss without falling in. We can feel the dread without the danger. But there's something deeper, something more uncomfortable. We tell these stories because they reveal us, our fears, our moral boundaries, our complicity. Burke and Hare force us to ask questions we'd rather not answer. How much is a life worth? Who decides? When does desperation become evil? When does silence become guilt? This story endures because it's a mirror. We see ourselves in it, not as the killers, but as the crowd. The ones who watched, the ones who bought tickets to the execution, the ones who profited, who looked away, who said nothing. We are fascinated by monsters because we need them to be monsters. Because if they're just men, desperate, ordinary, human, then we have to confront something far more terrifying. What would we do in their place? There is a distance between witness and accomplice. But how wide is it, really? You're watching this now, listening to my voice, consuming this story like thousands before you. You feel horror, yes, maybe disgust, maybe fascination. But you're still here, still listening. Does that make you complicit? When we tell stories of tragedy, of violence, of suffering, are we honoring the dead, or are we using them? Packaging their pain into narrative, into entertainment, into content that gets views, likes, shares. We say we're remembering. We say we're learning. But are we? Or are we just spectators at another execution, another public dissection, another display of bodies turned into spectacle? The ethics of storytelling are tangled. Every documentary, every true crime podcast, every historical deep dive walks a razor's edge between education and exploitation. We frame it as justice, as remembrance, as warning. But the dead can't consent to how their stories are told. They can't profit from the clicks. They can't correct the narrative. Burke's body is still on display. His story is still being sold. And the 16 people he killed, they're footnotes, props in someone else's horror story. How many of their names do you know? How many do I know? We remember the monster. We forget the victims. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy of all. Mary Patterson, James Wilson, Abigail Simpson, Mary Haldane, Peggy Haldane, Anne McDougall, Mary Doherty, Joseph the Miller, an old woman named Effie. A nameless drunk found in an alley, a boy no one claimed. Others we will never know. 16 people. 16 lives reduced to transaction slips and medical records. 16 names, most of them lost, forgotten, erased by the same machinery that killed them. History remembers Burke. History remembers Hare. It remembers Dr. Knox, the scandal, the trial, the execution. But the victims, they are ghosts, silent, invisible, reduced once again to the margins, to footnotes in someone else's horror story. We don't know what Mary Patterson dreamed about. We don't know if Joseph the Miller had children. We don't know what Effie's voice sounded like or what made her laugh, or how she ended up alone in a boarding house with men who saw her only as currency. They were people before they were bodies. They had names before they became numbers. They existed fully and completely until someone decided they didn't need to anymore. And now, all that remains is the silence. The empty room, the cold dissection table, the outline of a body that once breathed, once felt, once hoped for something more than this. We tell their story, but we do not hear their voices. Perhaps we never will.